Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Nick Godfrey, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Nick, today we have Sharon Barber, a seasoned leader in cybersecurity, technology, and operational resiliency, and who has an extensive career working in financial services.
Yeah, David, great. It's great to have Sharon with us. Sharon has had multiple executive roles at Lloyds Banking Group, including Group CIO and Group Chief Security Officer for a decade. She's led transformational risk changes, building recognized cyber capabilities, and representing the UK at the G7 Cyber Conference. Currently, Sharon is the co-chair of the UK's National Cyber Advisory Board, and she is also an independent member of the Bank of England's RTGS CHAPS board.
Let's get to today's episode. Sharon, welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Let's kick things off by discussing your involvement in the UK National Cyber Advisory Board. So just starting, for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you tell us a little bit about the NCAB's purpose?
Certainly, and firstly, thank you very much for having me here today. I get excited for this conversation. So from a NCAB perspective, it's there to support the government in their delivery of the national cyber strategy and help to foster cybersecurity for the full ecosystem. And ultimately, its purpose is to provide a forum for a much more inclusive dialogue, allowing government to hear alternative viewpoints and harness the networks across the industry. And if you think about some of the activities that government need to do, such as develop and implement new policies or technologies, they need to do it with an industry understanding and perspective. So, it makes it much more effective when they get into that implementation phase. And to help with this, the NCAB role is there to provide challenge to the currently held cyber perceptions and priorities that are in place. And so then go on to identify practical areas of collaboration between government and the wider cyber sector to make that a real thing.
I really like that. I think it underscores kind of the value and the need for partnership, and it recognizes that robust national cybersecurity isn't really achieved by any single entity, but to your point, it's really harnessing, I think, the collective insights across industry. And we certainly see that with some of the public-private partnerships here in the US as well. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on how this group works directly with the boardroom and how it kind of impacts the broader cyber ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So it's a bit mixed, actually. So the cyber awareness and expertise among boardrooms, varies quite significantly. Only a small number of boardrooms, and their members have dedicated cyber expertise, and even fewer ensure those members receive ongoing training to stay informed. Whereas if you look in contrast, most boards have limited cyber awareness and lack any structured cyber training for their members. And the strategy is aiming to improve all cyber boardroom skills and awareness so that they're equipped to ask the right questions, understand the organisational risks that they have, which will then allow them to make better decisions and ultimately improve their organisational cyber resilience, which again will make for a much more enhanced UK cyber posture. And a really good example of where we've seen in the past new regulation implemented in the financial sector, which is my background previously, and where it then went on to improve boardroom awareness, is the CBEST. And I don't know if you're aware of what the CBEST, but for those not familiar with that, it's a framework to assess the cyber resilience of financial institutions through an intelligence-led simulated cyber attacks. And it's the nearest thing you'll get to a real-world attack, when you're trying to test yourself and work that through. It's independent and it's completed by an accredited third party who works in unison with that organisation and the regulator with the purpose of identifying areas for improvement for their security posture. As part of that process, the associated boards are expected to understand the testing and the outcomes, making sure that their executive teams are then taking the appropriate actions to improve their security position. And then prior to that, whilst most financial organisations conducted this type of testing, like red team testing themselves, boards weren't actually involved and they weren't aware of the potential challenges and the risks to their organisations that they could be facing. And so actually they really raised the bar in that way. So, it's a much better outcome that you'll get. So better skills and much more cyber awareness is where the aim is.
Yeah, I think it's great that boards have, increasing sort of understanding of their role, and certainly I'd agree CBUS had a very sort of pivotal, role in achieving that. I think the interesting thing about NCAD, Sharon, is that it's collectively got the sort of strategic vantage point to see, potentially everything that's coming at us in terms of future threats and priorities and so on and so forth across government, industry, academia, and so forth. And so from that perspective, what would you say are the most critical strategic shifts or future trends in the cyber agenda that boards should be thinking about, as they continue to evolve and be more focused on the future and anticipating rather than just reacting?
Yeah, absolutely. The boards today really do need to be thinking much more strategically in regards to cyber. So, way beyond compliance, which has always been something they've always been thinking about, they need to do much more than what's expected of them, and move much more towards long-term cyber resilience as they head forwards. That's really where we need to get to. And if you link that back to the strategy and particularly the improving cyber resilience pillar, we all know that the threat is a constant, and boards need to be prepared, so that they're equipped to steer their organisation so that they're resilient to attack. And today, it's very much they need to be thinking along the lines of, it's when you're going to be impacted rather than if you're going to be impacted. Because we all see, don't we, the best organisations are attacked, which then goes on to make recovery that much more critical. Yeah. So boards really do need to focus on the cyber resilience and health of their organisations. They need to be able to recover from a ransomware attack. So having those immutable backups in there, make sure they're available and tested, and not just it's a tick box exercise of they've done something in the past. They really should be conducting crisis simulations to test and prove their recoveries, and they should be considering having third-party experts on hand to support them both in recovery and also in their planning and preparation. Because we all know that when you're trying to do this in the middle of an incident, it doesn't work. You'll get delays on your recovery, even if it then even be possible. And undoubtedly, it'll be way more expensive and costly to that organisation. So I think there's some key things boards really do need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, preparation is absolutely key. And I think one of the nice side effects of doing the preparation, and as you said, having, the boards think of this as an inevitability rather than something to be outright prevented, is it positions them and the company and the support teams to be ready. It also sort of destigmatizes the idea that the cyber attack is a bad thing. Cyber attack is just one of many risks that organizations have to manage. So if that was what the boards sort of need to focus on, what would you say boards need in terms of their capabilities and their skills and everything in order to be able to successfully navigate those things?
Yeah, totally. And I think, firstly, I think they do need to have the right skills on the board so that they're able to ask the right questions of their executive and their technical people. And if they don't have that today, they should be seeking external advice, whilst they work on their demographic and their skills. In the short term, I'd definitely recommend looking at the NCSC's board toolkit, as it's easy to digest, for a starter. That's somewhere where I'd definitely start to think on. And then secondly, we all know cyber is no longer just an IT and a security issue or a risk. It's a core part of national security. It's critical for economic stability, and it's key on public trust. So for organisations, it really does need to be a group accountability and not just that of the CISOs. Although the CISO, as we know today, and I'm really pleased to see that, is now a really critical role and should be about advising the board and the CEO. But ultimately, it's about everyone taking accountability. Being ignorant on cyber is not a defence anymore. You can't do that. You can't keep your organisation safe, and you can't keep the UK safe doing that.
Yeah.
Skills are key. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think it emphasizes the importance that cybersecurity is important to everybody across the C-suite. Everybody has a role in it within their organizations. So I specifically wanted to ask you, since you're based in the UK, about the UK Cyber Governance Code of Practice, which I know was developed with significant input from different leaders across sectors. Nick and I actually put together a blog on the code, I think about a month and a half ago, that's out there if our listeners are interested in reading a little bit more about it. But Sharon, how do you see it practically influencing boardroom discussions today? And what do you think some of the benefits and challenges are with the framework implementation?
So, I think it's a really good way to get boards talking about cyber and taking action. The code gives boards a language and a framework to discuss cyber risk confidently, and less reliance on technical jargon so they don't get confused and mixed up in that space. We are seeing boards starting to use the NCC board toolkit that I mentioned earlier and the code principles as a self-assessment framework. So we're starting to see that. And we're also starting to see, that some are integrating, code-based checklists into their internal audits or board evaluations. So we're starting to see some of that, and in time it will lead to better decisions and investment decisions. It will really help boards to justify, their investments as, risk mitigations, and not just think about them as IT upgrades, which we do see that a lot today when people aren't informed as much as they should be. And it should also support the enhanced resilience by helping boards to invest in, the most impactful areas that they need to invest in, and also be more prepared to answer questions, that they get from regulators, insurers, customers, on how their cyber risk is being governed in their organisation. So, that's all the things that I think it will help them do. But as I mentioned earlier, many board members still that basic cyber fluency, and especially in the small and medium-sized firms, embedding cyber, governance processes, even if lightweight, is often seen as burdensome. And so they need to implement governance, but ensure that it's helping them achieve the right outcomes of better resilience rather than compliance. And so they do need to work through that. And I think that's a challenge that we'll get through because you haven't got the skills out there today. And so how do they implement it in the right way? And, as we know, culture change takes quite some time. So embedding a cyber-aware culture is much more than policy. It requires behaviour change, leadership modelling, and boards really do have to start on that sooner because that could take some time to make that happen.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's a really approachable framework, I find, for board members. I looked at the 5 core principles of risk management, strategy, people, incident response, assurance. These are all topics I think the board members are interested in, and it's very approachable, I think, from a board perspective to learn a little bit more about these areas.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's really important, to your point a minute ago, Sharon, about the board being able to access the topic and work the topic without being inundated with technical jargon. But that said, one of the challenges that we as CISOs have always had is that just as we get used to securing one technology paradigm, a new one comes along and we've got to get our heads around that. And so, at the moment, the two things that are generating lots of discussion and some apprehension in some areas, and we've discussed at NCAB, is, quantum readiness or post-quantum crypto, and then obviously artificial intelligence. So I guess if we, focus on quantum to start with, it's an incredibly complex technical conversation, but actually it is something boards need to be thinking about, isn't it? So how do you think boards should work that particular concern?
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone's talking about quantum and AI, and if they're not, they should be, because, they're both exciting, for defense and attack, so it's, great topics, to be fair. So, from a cyber perspective, the risk is that, as we all know, from a quantum angle, future large-scale quantum computers, will eventually be able to break the public key cryptography, which will create the risks that the adversaries will then encrypt data today for that future decryption as we go forward. And as to when that becomes real, there is so much speculation and variation on when that capability will be available and when the risk will crystallize. And so there's always a lot of debate around that. Well, do we need to do it now? Do we need to do it later? How does that really work? So I think for boards, based on that variation, I think it makes good sense for boards to look at a trusted source to follow guidance on this, because otherwise how will they know when to do it, what to do? And I don't think there's any better than the NCSC. They put out and published a paper in March of this year, setting out 3 phases up to 2035. So a 10-year plan. And just go on a little bit of that. In phase 1, which is from now to 2028, boards should be looking to create an inventory of all their cryptographic dependencies and use this to draft a migration plan. And then you move on to phase 2 from 2028 that focuses on deploying priority upgrades and piloting post-quantum solutions. And then phase 3, which is 2031 onwards, is completing the enterprise PQC migration, including the supply chain. So, so I think it lays it out quite well and quite easily. But the challenge and concern that we all have is that organisations don't address this until it becomes urgent and the risk then crystallises, which, is the worst case scenario that you can get to. You're trying to run around at the last minute, and actually, your risk is pretty significant at that point. Whereas if you start now, it can be a slow burn, and organizations can then plan their upgrades in their natural refresh cycles. And ultimately, I think it will reduce costs and risk over that 10-year period. So quantum should absolutely be on their agenda. It should be on their strategic agenda. They should be talking about it. They should be making sure their teams are thinking about it. They've got that thought process. And they should be, as a minimum, making sure they're looking at their inventory now, rather than wait for later. It's a really critical, I think, point.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the nice thing about that approach is it lends itself very well to traditional, well-understood forms of governance, right? So they can have this decade-long plan. They can see the chunks of work that need to be done in it, and they can, to some extent, measure it and therefore manage it. So I think that's right. If we flip to AI, the conversations around AI are it's a double-edged sword. It's going to potentially enable attackers to do novel things, although I don't think at the moment we're seeing particularly novel attacks. We're just seeing increased efficiency around traditional attack types. But obviously also we think AI's got a role to play on the defensive side in cybersecurity as well. But, how you think about that from a board perspective and the governance and framework mechanisms that organizations should use to oversee this, because it's a complex and fast-moving space, isn't it?
Yeah, so it definitely is fast-moving, without a doubt, on that one. And it is definitely a double-edged sword, Nick, as you said, on that side. Whilst it can be and is used to enable attacks, particularly we see it, don't we, in the deep fake and social engineering spaces. You see that where you've seen, recently seen increases of attacks where there's impersonations of executives, where their voices are recorded, or even video for fraud or access purposes. You see quite a lot of that going on. And actually, it's getting really good. And it's actually really hard, unless you're a true expert, to be able to look through that. But I'm a believer that AI can also be a force for defense. So, I think it's good for us on the security side as well. And if we look at security operations, we're already seeing the benefits in threat detection and response, where AI can rapidly analyze huge volumes of telemetry. It detects anomalies, and then it enables us to react much faster in our responses. So I think there's some really great things there. And we're also seeing, in defense as well, where it can spot subtleties around anomalies that we might see in insider threats and zero-day exploits, by learning what that normal behavior is. So we are seeing, I think, from a defense perspective, can really, really help us in that way. So boards do need to make sure they're talking about it. Now, we all know they are talking about it because there's a constant chatter about it, but are they doing the right things? And that's the bit, we've got to make sure that they have got the right frameworks and the right governance in place so that they can actually move forward in the right way. And I do think it can be pretty daunting if you don't know where to start, for everybody. It's like, well, where do I go? Because there's quite a lot out there. If you look at the frameworks out there, there are quite a significant number of frameworks out there. And I think people should just start and be sensible in what they need to do, first of all, so start small and then start to build through that. And if you are starting from scratch and you're looking at frameworks, from a cyber perspective, NIST has a good framework around risk management for AI in this space, and it's a good place to start. It's a risk-based approach to AI governance, and it's adopted across many countries, sector neutral, so it makes it pretty easy to adapt for your organization. And it includes all of the important aspects a board would need to ensure that you set up, governance correctly in that space. So making sure you've got the right roles and accountabilities in place, making sure, it's pragmatic, that it's an operational model for embedding ethics into governance, making sure you've got the right metrics in place, and that risk management is where you want it to be. So I think people have got to start small, and you've got to start with something that I think is, well thought through and easy to follow. So, for me, it's a start point rather than an end point, but boards do need to make sure they get on that journey. Otherwise, it's only going to increase their risk.
Yeah, absolutely. They've got to get started, as you say.
Yeah.
It's a great point about the frameworks, and we actually can attach the NIST framework and Google's own secure AI framework to this podcast as well if board members want to learn a little bit more. I do want to just draw on your extensive experience within the financial services industry as well. Particularly, I know you spent time at Lloyd's. You've had a lot of firsthand interactions with boards in that sector, which is arguably one of the most heavily regulated when it comes to cybersecurity. What are some of the most significant challenges that you personally faced in communicating cyber risk and tech strategy to boards? Are there any stories or lessons learned or kind of tips that you have for both CISOs and board members in their security discussions?
I'm not sure I can share too many stories. What stays in the boardroom or what happens in the boardroom stays in the boardroom, so on those ones. But as mentioned previously, I think in the past, some of the biggest challenges have been around the lack of cyber fluency among board members. Most are not from a technical background and can struggle to interpret cyber risks in business terms. And so for myself, definitely somewhere where I was started, and for CISOs in general, you've got to adapt your communication style so that you communicate in risk and business terms, and particularly how a cyber attack or weakness could impact their business as opposed to get into that technical jargon. So that's definitely, from a CISO perspective, you've got to get in that boardroom and you've got to change the way you communicate. And it's really, really, difficult sometimes to switch from that technical to the business language, making sure that you are using business aligned metrics, and that you hone your storytelling. Storytelling is key. If your language is too technical, you lose the key messages in a waffling dialogue, because you often, I'm not saying our security people like to waffle on, but we do a little bit at times, and so, trying to explain the detail because we want everyone to fully understand it. Well, you've then lost your opportunity, haven't you? And then you've lost the board. And so practice that storytelling so you get those key, what are your key messages that they need to take away? They don't need to know everything about security. They need to know the key things that you want them to know. And that's it, really. Another challenge I'd say that you come up against in the boardroom is obviously competing priorities and whether cyber gets enough time on the agenda. The CISO has to make sure they use their time wisely and always also make sure that you utilize, I always say this, an internal or external incident as much as possible. It's often in these external events, no one wants an internal one, or like to see external ones, but the external ones, boards always want to know how exposed we are to that event. And it's a good opportunity to make sure you use that wisely, because you can, talk about that specific event, but you could also talk about much more general, wider things that you need to get on their agenda. So, use the opportunities that come your way. And then another area I'd say is around short-term focus. Boards can be in the moment, can't they? Because they've got, they've got their targets hit where they need to do, so that short-term focus and justifying spend can be quite difficult, especially, if they're under budgetary pressures. And that does happen with everybody. It's that situation, what I've found in the past is, using independent assessments can actually help you, or peer comparisons to help, with credibility of your proposals. So the sort of areas that I've used in the past that I think are pretty helpful to help you support the investment that you're needed. And then actually, I should have said it at the beginning, but I'm telling you at the last thing. I think that the really most important thing is you need to make sure that your cyber risk appetite is aligned, because sometimes as a CISO and the board, they might be different and you might be talking in quite a mismatched expectation. I think that's really important to have that aligned at the very beginning. And not everyone does that. So I think having those conversations and documenting that risk appetite early, I think that's a good platform to actually build on.
No, it's powerful advice for sure. Last question, and I kind of call this usually the drop the mic moment, but we've talked a lot today, from national strategies to emerging technology to some of your own personal experience. What is one piece of advice that you would give to our cyber savvy boardroom listeners today based on this discussion?
It has to be cyber knowledge. It has to be what is their personal skills and what are they, equipped to do? Because if they don't understand it, how do they then have the right skills to inform or to ask of their executives? So for me, it's very much about education themselves. There's lots more. I'd have loads actually. I can give you a list of 10, but that's my one. I'm not sure it's mic drop though.
It's perfect. It's perfect. Sharon, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon.
Thanks very much.